The first time I first heard it and even dealt with earned value and work breakdown structure was when I was really my first job after college, in which I was working for Computer Sciences Corporation as a consultant to them. And I was able to work at the Department of Energy. And at that time, they already had something that was similar to EVM and work breakdown structures, but they wanted to update it because the Air Force had actually done a big job of implementing earned value management and work breakdown structure into their policies. So they actually hired the people who did the work for the Air Force and wrote the policies and brought them into the Department of Energy, and they were as consultants as well to Computer Sciences Corporation. So I got tagged as my first job is to actually work with them on developing the Department of Energy's next generation of earned value management and work breakdown structure for them. And so that's the first time I ever heard of it. It was really right after I graduated college and went to work there. So I became involved in the mill standard in 1988, about 10 years later. I had joined a company called Management Consulting and Research. It was actually one of the, I had just joined, and I had been asked by the vice president of the company if I knew anything about work breakdown structures. And oddly enough, from my past experience, sure enough, I had helped write the work breakdown structure policy for the Department of Energy. So I said, sure, I was able to do that if he wanted me to help in developing work breakdown structures. And he said, well, he had a customer at the Office of the Secretary of Defense who needed to update Mill Standard 881 at that time A, which was, that mill standard is the defense material systems, essentially, for work breakdown structures for defense material systems. And he said, well, you need to meet with the person there in department and see if they will approve you for helping them in that process. And I actually sat down and met with the person who was in charge of that, and her name was Jerry Asher. She was very famous, actually, in the Department of Defense because she was the person who would collect all kinds of costs from all kinds of contractors on what it cost them to do business for the weapon systems that they were developing. And the work breakdown structure was how they reported that. Unfortunately, the work breakdown structure had not been, the mill standard specifically, had not been updated since 1973. And here it is 15 years later, and you can imagine there's been a lot of changes in how you develop a system and so forth. One big example was the fact that they still had key punch cards in the discussion in the 1973 edition. So she seemed to like me, and which was good, and I liked her. She was a very nice person, and I decided to go ahead, and they decided to go ahead and let me help her in that process. So that's how I got started with the mill standard. That was, by the way, a 5-year project because they hadn't updated that in so long. Everybody had their own opinion of what a work breakdown structure element and support was. It's lasted this long to continue doing this document over and over again is because things change over time. What we've seen from even 1973 to obviously 1988, and that was actually published in 1993, as I said. There's a lot of changes that go on in manufacturing and technology and all of the elements that make up how you develop these systems. Each time I've done this, and I've done it numerous times, I can't even begin to count, but there's been, I think, 6 times total. something changes, something's different. Just a few years ago, all of a sudden there was unmanned aircraft systems, and we didn't have those. And now all of a sudden it's become a big part of the military. So sure enough, we've had to add an appendix associated with that. As I look into the future, there's a lot of things that are going to be kind of hypersonic types of systems, and we haven't done that yet, and I expect that that will probably be in the next edition when we do update it next. It's been a long road in this, and it's changed over time. When we first started the MIL standard and updating it, we did it strictly with government people. And they were determining what the system would look like and how it would be designed and so forth. And finally, after a few times of doing that, we decided, and actually it was my decision, is to say we really need to have industry be a part of the discussion instead of part of the review. And so we actually brought them in, and it has become, for the last several times, probably since the 2011 version of this, that we've really taken a very strong opinion from the industry side and felt that they had that right to have that. So it's a joint effort, though, and both the military and the government folks who are supporting, as well as industry, are working collaboratively in this effort. A lot of compromise, you might imagine. A lot of it has to do with what the government would like to see in reporting, but at the same time, industry wants to make sure that they have a WBS that matches what they do in terms of how they build and develop systems. So I think it's a good combination. So the difference between a work breakdown structure and a contract work breakdown structure is that the contract work breakdown structure is really a subset of the overarching work breakdown structure. So typically you would have, for any given weapon system program, you would have a program work breakdown structure which would represent the WBS for the program, the overarching program in which the government, as the customer, would be responsible for. And from that, the contractor who gets the award would have the contract work breakdown structure, which would be a subset of the program, because the government may in fact have multiple contractors doing multiple elements within their program. And so each one of those contractors would have a contract work breakdown structure, but the government would have one work breakdown structure, which would be the overarching one, which is of course the program work breakdown structure. One of the biggest problems we encounter is the misuse of the work breakdown structure, and quite frankly, not only the misuse, but the misunderstanding of what a work breakdown structure is. The way the Department of Defense actually defines it, but this is really universal, it's not just the Department of Defense, but is the fact that it is a product-oriented work breakdown structure. One in which there's a relationship of one element to the next. But ultimately what you're developing and delivering is a product. And of course that would be in the Department of Defense a weapon system of some sort, or even a subsystem of that, as long as it's considered a product. The way the work breakdown structure is actually created is using what we call a 100% rule, which is that for all the children of a particular parent should be a part of that parent, so that no child should be left by itself, if you know what I mean. In other words, it's a 100%, everything that's a child belongs to that parent. Too often, the misuse of a work breakdown structure, and I'll give you this as an example, is software. Software is something that goes as part of a hardware element, usually. You need software to make the hardware work. So what happens often is that people are very interested in software, and they want to understand what the cost of software is. So they make software a separate work breakdown structure element, and leave the hardware as a separate work breakdown structure element, but not tied to the software. So what happens is that if I have a communication system that uses software, needs software to run, I have the hardware in one WBS element that's not in the same level or part of the work breakdown structure that the software is in. Mainly because people are trying to collect all that software separately because they want to get that cost. So the idea is that as long as you can associate something with the element, it should be associated with it. So software is associated with that communication system, it should be part of that communication system. Keeping it separate means that you've misunderstood or misestimate what the cost of that communication system is because the software is not included in it. One of the things that people are talking about and are concerned about, and I had to come up against early on when I was developing the MIL standard and making updates to this, was what do you call software if it's not a product? And so the answer to that is that you had to look at what it was doing. What's the impact of what that software does? And essentially, you had to look at it in terms of what is it providing in terms of capability to that hardware. So there's all kinds of capability that you get with software, because software is, as I said, is a part of everything now in today's environment. Going back to that communication system, the capability that software is providing, quite frankly, is the ability to actually transmit information from one communication system to the other. So that's a capability that software is providing. So yes, that is a product in that sense, and therefore you can manage your software by those products. We call them computer software configuration items, which are unique elements that we account for as capability and use them as the product that we deliver. And that's how they manage and that's how they build the software, is against those types of configuration items. My role is really to be the coordinator of all the information I get from both government and industry and put that in a logical form within the document. Agile is obviously something that came out new this year, and it's been around for a lot of years, but it's new for the standard this year, for the MIL standard. And so one of the things that came out on that is, of course, that Agile is somewhat different in software development. At least the perception of it is somewhat different in software development than other software development has been in the past. The problem is the fact that it's no different, really, in some ways, than any other evolutionary type software development activity. Spiral, iterative development are all very much the same as Agile. The difference that Agile is how it's developed and how you use it. And within the MIL standard, the concern is that if you didn't talk about Agile when we were developing the latest version, we would probably be missing a big piece of the process. So what we did was to actually talk about Agile in terms of its development process and how you use it. And ultimately, there's some disconnects, quite frankly, between the words that Agile uses and the words that we use in the MIL standard. And I shouldn't say really disconnects, but they're differences you can use the same word, but it has two different meanings, one for agile and one for the mill standard. So the example I'll give is release. Usually in the mill standard, a release would mean that we would release a package of software to be implemented into the hardware. In Agile, the word release means it's just part of a process of the development of software. And so those have two different meanings. The concern I had when we were developing the standard was trying to make sure that people understood when we said we were doing a software release that we weren't using the word release in terms of Agile. So what we tried to do was to give an example of how Agile could be used within the standard. And Agile comes in many flavors. It comes in stories, it comes in features, it comes in epics. And for those CSCIs, those computer software configuration items I talked about, if you had an epic level of software for those CSCIs, that means you'd have really a capability description for those CSCIs. And that the multiple CSCIs at epic level would be a release for the mill standards definition. So when we were updating mill standard for this year, 2018, we had to look at Agile as a major part of our process. I'm a big fan of work breakdown structures and earned value management, and I feel that they are very important in today's environment with both industry and government. And I wanted to make sure that influence of using them was very important and continue to be important. I as part of my job, my actual job, I actually have to do the development of WBSs and I actually have to perform earned value management processes and so forth. So in order to try to influence that, I became very involved in the associations associated with that. And those include, obviously, the College of Performance Management, also the International Cost Estimating and Analysis Association, and the National Defense Industrial Association. I'm the only person, actually, as far as I know, in the lifetime of the collaboration of those three organizations, to be the only one who's been on the board of all three at the same time. And in order to do that, and I did that on purpose, quite frankly, because I felt that if I could get an influence from the cost estimating people, who is the International Cost Estimating Analysis Organization, with the earned value people, they actually, believe it or not, don't necessarily see the relationship between those two. And yet there is a strong relationship. And then bringing in the program manager from the NDIA approach and that organization, you could actually get some consensus on how the three of them are actually work together well and become a much important part of our overall acquisition process. One of the things I did as well was obviously run for president of the College of Performance Management, feeling that as a leader in that area, I'd be able to be more available to be able to bring those three organizations together collaboratively. They actually always work together, but no one would ever see the relationship between particularly the cost estimating and the earned value management. I spent a lot of time with Wayne Abba, and he and I talked about this, and I actually went around the country at various conferences and so forth and talked about how the cost estimate is in fact the baseline for earned value management. Once you've developed that cost estimate, you've actually started earned value management in the next process by starting to monitor your work against that estimate. So I think while people knew that, it's just the fact that they never really talked about it or thought about it, I think, in many cases, made it a little more realistic. And for many years, that was one of the biggest presentations I keep making, and people go, "Oh, that makes sense now. I understand how that works," and so forth. So I feel good that that has now been a lot more accepted, and it's more of a reality of what it's all about. One of the other things that I've been a part of, and very fortunate, is the fact that I'm part of the development of an ISO standard for both earned value management and work breakdown structures. This is something that came about back in about 2015, that the International Organization of Standards, which is ISO, had decided to put out a standard associated with that, because they had actually just recently, at that point in time, put out a standard for program project management. And the decision is that they wanted to expand that, and the best way to expand that was, in fact, to include disciplines within the project and program management, and earned value and work breakdown structure being the first two from their perspective that they wanted to address. So for the last 3 years, from 2015 to today in 2018, I've been on the United States Technical Advisory Group, which is really the highest level that you can get in the U.S. associated with the development of standards, and supporting them in terms of how these standards are being developed and how they can be used across the world. And I've been on the teams specifically for earned value. There's a large group, but I'm on the critical teams, those that are specifically working and writing the standard versus those who are just reviewing it and looking at it from an oversight perspective. So in both cases, I've had a great amount of input on both of those standards. I'm very proud of that. Both of these standards are going to be released very soon, sometime in probably late 2018, and we expect that they will have a big impact not only in the US but also across the world. So we're looking very forward to that happening. Well, the future of earned value management and work breakdown structure is kind of interesting. I think they may take some different paths. Within the work breakdown structure, I think where we were talking about a product-oriented structure, I think we're going to start seeing different types of structures now. Even process-oriented, functionally oriented type structures, where in the past we would never allow that. But I think today's environment and how we are creating and building new systems gives you that opportunity to look at it a little differently. But I also think it has a lot to do with technology and the fact that within computer systems now you can look at things in many different ways, shapes, and forms without losing that relationship. So from a work breakdown structure perspective, I think we're going to see some changes in terms of what I said was the 100% solution. It will probably be a 100% solution for processes, for functions, for locations, for you name it. It's that type of situation. So I think that's where the future is there. As far as earned value management, it's always been on the cusp of either being great or being gone. People either love it or they hate it, and it's one of those things that has been around for more than 50 years, so clearly it's lasted quite a while. I think it's going to change from its rigidity with how they handle it. I think we're going to have to look at earned value as not only a performance measurement tool, but as hopefully one that would help the industry and government understand where things are going earlier in time rather than being later in time. The biggest complaint is always that I get earned value information after the fact. Again, I think in today's world of technology and the use of more systems to develop and build things, you'll have that real-time information. And I think that that will make earned value a lot more valuable in its future, and hopefully to go on at least, if not more, 50 years beyond.